Hey everybody, we have just started reading through the book of Jeremiah in the first two and a bit chapters. And as we talked about last week, Jeremiah is a prophet who is called by God and to speak his judgment and justice over a rebellious people. I thought today it would be really helpful to get into the timeline of Jeremiah so we can understand what's going on in the world at this stage. And so the rest of the events of the book will make more sense to us. So the prophet Jeremiah was probably born in about 644 BC in the southern kingdom of Judah. Remember, if you remember biblical history, the people came into the promised land out of Egypt and established a kingdom which didn't last very long. That kingdom survived under Saul and then David and then Solomon, and then after Solomon died, there was a civil war and it split into two kingdoms, the kingdom of Israel in the north and the kingdom of Judah in the south. And those two kingdoms survived sort of side by side for a while, but then the northern kingdom was conquered in about 721 BC by the Assyrians, their immediate neighbor to the north. The southern kingdom of Judah somehow survived. Mainly, the Bible credits that survival to the faithfulness of the kings of Judah and the people at the time. But after that event happened, where the northern kingdom of Israel got conquered, there were, more and more wicked kings, priests, prophets, people. And Judah started to go the same way that its northern neighbors did. And so Jeremiah is working in a time of Judah's decline. He begins prophesying probably when he is a teenager, most people think, which is why Jeremiah chapter 1, he sort of cries out to God and says, I don't feel like I'm old enough yet. And God just says, don't worry, I'll be with you, I'll rescue you, just preach the words that I tell you to preach. So for the next 40 years or so, Jeremiah preaches to his people in the southern kingdom of Judah. He begins his reign, his time during the reign of King Josiah, who was a good king. But Josiah's children turned out to be not as good and godly as their father and grandfather, and they started worshiping idols and doing all kinds of detestable practices, and God's judgment, which he had been withholding because of Josiah's reign, was going to come in return. He had a case to bring, a court case to bring against his people because they had violated their part of the covenant, that they had not been faithful to him. Now, at this time, this was a really hectic time to be alive because the kingdom of Judah was a very tiny kingdom in the ancient Near East, and it was in the middle of a giant battle that was happening between three superpowers at the time. So you had Egypt in the south, you had Assyria immediately to the north, and then you had Babylon to the north and east. And all these superpowers were fighting against one another for control of that whole region. And this took place over centuries. By the time of Jeremiah, Babylon had sort of won most of the battles. That Babylon had unified and started taking over these other superpowers. First Assyria, and were even encroaching into Egypt, which is why Judah is facing these Babylonians who have come through their kingdom. At the end of Josiah's life, he is killed in a battle, and his son, his name Jehoahaz, and then Jehoiakim, gets put on the throne, and his sons try to make alliances with Egypt and Assyria. And well, this is not what God wants. God wants his people to turn to him and depend on him, that he was the one that can rescue from these invaders, and yet the people don't listen. And they continue to put their trust in other nations and the gods of those nations. And this is the main sort of criticism that Jeremiah has for his community. In the end of Jeremiah chapter 1, God says this to the people of Judah, verse 15, their kings will come and set up thrones in the entrance of the gates of Jerusalem. This is talking about the Babylonians. They will come against all her surrounding walls and against all the towns of Judah. I will pronounce my judgment on my people because of their wickedness in forsaking me, in burning incense to other gods, and in worshiping what their hands have made. Then, chapter 2 of Jeremiah goes on to describe that this is exactly what they have done. That God was like a husband that Israel had married long ago, back in when they were at Mount Sinai, and they had agreed, we will be your people and you will be our God. Yes, we will uphold this covenant. And it was like a marriage covenant, that God is their husband and Israel is his bride, and everything was good. But we know that that didn't last long, and that God's people just continued to seek out other gods that aren't even alive, he says. In chapter 2, he goes on to describe all the things that he blessed his people with, and all the ways that he delivered them and rescued them and gave them abundance and prosperity and comfort and safety and wealth. And yet the people continue to reject God and turn to other idols. And in verse 13 of chapter 2, God says this to the people. He says, my people have committed 2 sins. 1, they have forsaken me, the spring of living water. And 2, they have dug their own cisterns, broken cisterns that cannot hold water. This is the accusation that God brings, that what they had in him was this well of living water that would perpetually bring them life in abundance. And yet they rejected that and decided to go out in the desert and dig their own holes. But those holes, those cisterns, were dry and empty and broken. They can't even hold water. It's this picture of rejecting something that is good and present and gives you life, to go and do your own thing that brings you nothing but death. This is the biblical picture of the same thing that Adam and Eve do in the garden, that in eating from the tree, they're saying, you know what, we can be God ourselves. We want to discern good and evil for ourselves. We don't need that God. In the desert, this is what the people do, that even though God had delivered them and brought them through, they're like, you know what, we're going to worship these other gods. Even though we've seen all the things that God, this God, Yahweh, can do for us, you know what, we're gonna go out on our own and do our own thing. And this is what people do today. Despite the love and compassion and mercy and life that God has and promises everybody, we as humans have this tendency to say, yeah, nah, I'm gonna go out on my own. I'm gonna follow my own passions and dreams. I'm gonna stake my trust on other things that I think are gonna give me more of what I want. Jeremiah goes on to describe this as like committing adultery. That you're like, Israel's like a bride that has, cheated on her husband. And now they're wondering, as the foreign armies are coming in and disaster is about to overtake them, God, why aren't you doing anything for us? And God says, because you have put your trust somewhere else. Why would you, after divorcing your husband and cheating on him, chapter 3 says, would I want to take you back? Why would I do that? And yet, this sets up a problem, that this is exactly what God does. And this is exactly what his people are like. That even when his people cheat and commit adultery, that God forgives and welcomes back. But the warning is there. If God is the God of living water, why would you want to pursue anything else? And that is a challenge for you and I, even in the world that we live in. That, yeah, sure, we may not have, carved idols that we bow down and worship and pray to, but we certainly do pursue other things, don't we, for happiness in life, and blessing. But God says, I am the true living water. Come to me and you will find everything that you're looking for. So it's a challenge to us about how we think, how we spend, how we save, how we give, where our time and energy and thoughts go to. Is it to Him, the source of living water? Or are we digging our own dry, broken cisterns?